So, as we all know, the Palestinian protests are still continuing on. There's a lot of people, once again, calling out the genocide, the crisis that's happening in Gaza. Let's be clear, the bombings are still ongoing and continuous. People are struggling. And, we here in the United States, there's a concern what's happening to a lot of activists and organizers. But the one thing I got to say is this recently caught my attention. That is, New York residents began hurling trash from their buildings at pro Palestinian protesters. This will probably get a lot of you angry. This will probably get a lot of you mad, but I think it's only fair that we do pull this up here and address it and talk about it. So, you got a warning. Don't get too angry, but plus also look, throwing something from that height, guess what? There's a thing called gravity. Heaven forbid there's heavy material in there and people get hurt. Can you imagine being in that car and that happens to you? So, that's what's happening. That's what's happening. So I want to pull up a little bit more into the article. Trash and suspected dog feces were thrown from an apartment block at pro-Palestinian protesters in Manhattan, New York on Monday, April 7th. Video captured by a demonstrator shows items and a bag of trash falling from an upper floor of the Summit, New York City luxury apartment block. Huh. Gee. There was a YouTuber named Eric Conover who was doing all those tours of those luxurious hotels. Too bad he had a crazy meltdown way back in New Hampshire. But anyways, he'll eviscerate us with his intelligence. Speaking to Storfel, the protester who wished to remain anonymous, said a resident on the 11th floor of the apartment block flung what appeared to be several bags of dog feces from their balcony. As police directed a pro-Palestinian protest past the Summit luxury apartment building, a resident on the 11th floor proceeded to throw several bags of what appeared to be dog feces from his balcony. To which I have to say, there's a good chance that also could have hit the police officers. That's a disruption of public, and that also could be viewed as assault. I mean, there's a lot of things that can be taken away from that. Whoever that person was on the 11th floor, I mean, you have a thing called a garbage chute. You have a dumpster. I mean, throwing it on the street, it's not like the olden day era of Victoria, England, where you throw your garbage out and that's it. Continue on. This was followed by 2 buckets of liquid containing a bleach-like odor. Oh yeah, because imagine if bleach gets in a person's eyes, and then a 10-gallon bin liner filled with large amounts of fresh excrement and hard objects that smashed a parked car window shield. The resident continued to goad protesters by displaying the Israeli flag and making rude gestures. The protest action organized by Within Our Lifetime, WOL, was held to coincide with World Health Day and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to the White House. Protesters also marched into New York City's Grand Central Terminal, chanting and waving flags inside at the entrance of the world-famous train station. So, look, I'm all for the right for assembly and free speech. I'm all for the right of organizing. What I'm against is when anybody, and I do mean anybody, decides to take it within their own power to throw objects, harass people, beat people, and no matter where you stand politically, I don't like the idea of objects being thrown off from a building, antagonizing protesters and doing that kind of stuff. I don't want to see anybody get hurt like that because, you're going to have one person who's probably so sociopathic enough to throw maybe other heavy material out from the building. I mean, who knows? There's a lot to take away from that. What if somebody maybe got a whole face full of bleach in their face? Oh no, a lot could happen, especially if it goes in their eyeballs. I mean, that's a bleach like odor. Doesn't take a genius to figure out what that is. And it just says a lot about everyone who's easily triggered. If something offends you, look away. Okay? If there's some speech you don't like, turn off. And yes, there's always going to be protests. Look, there's protests happening here in Chicago. Okay, fine. People have the right to assemble, but there's also something else I want to pull up here. That has to deal with this memo because there's going to probably be more protests happening. An attorney for Columbia University student organizer Mahmoud Khalil said Thursday that a memo submitted to an immigration judge shows the U.S. government is clearly going after Mahmoud and persecuting him for exercising his First Amendment rights. After a month of hiding the ball since Mahmoud's late-night unjust arrest in New York and taking him away to a remote detention center in Louisiana, immigration authorities have finally admitted that they have no case whatsoever against him. The lawyer Mark van der Hout said in a statement about a 2-page memo from the U.S. Department of State that was published by the Associated Press. Plainclothes federal agents accosted Khalil, a green card holder who finished his graduate studies at Columbia last year, and his pregnant wife, Noor Abdallah, a U.S. citizen, at their building in New York City on March 8th and took him into custody. Abdallah has said that this felt like a kidnapping because it was, and Khalil calls himself a political prisoner. As van der Hout explained Thursday, the government has charged Mahmoud with a rarely used provision of the immigration laws targeting the deportation or even unlawful permanent residents like Mahmoud, but Secretary of State Marco Rubio has provided no proof or evidence that these charges bear any viability against Mahmoud. Further, Secretary Rubio has shown that this is merely about targeting Mahmoud's free speech rights about Palestine. The Associated Press noted that a Department of Homeland Security spokesperson, Teresa McLaughlin, did not respond to questions about whether it had additional evidence against Khalil. Writing in an emailed statement, DHS did file evidence, but immigration court dockets are not available to the public. Rubio's memo was submitted to Judge Jamie Commons ahead of an immigration court hearing scheduled for Friday in Janina, Louisiana, and after the judge said earlier this week that the federal government either can provide sufficient evidence or not. If he's not removable, I'm not going to terminate this case. The memo suggests campus protests against the U.S.-backed Israeli assault on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip were inherently discriminatory against Jewish people, saying that Rubio determined the activities and presence of Khalil and other lawful permanent resident whose name is redacted would have potential serious adverse foreign policy consequences and would compromise a compelling U.S. foreign policy interest. These determinations are based on information regarding the participation roles of Redacted and Khalil in anti-Semitic protests and disruptive activities, which fosters a hostile environment for Jewish students in the United States, the memo continues. The public actions and continued presence of Redacted and Khalil in the United States undermine U.S. policy to combat anti-Semitism around the world and in the United States, in addition to efforts to protect Jewish students from harassment and violence in the United States. Van der Hout said that the immigration judge would have to find that the Secretary of State has reasonable ground to believe that the immigrant's presence or activities in the U.S. would have potential serious adverse foreign policy consequences, and that his presence, though he has only engaged in lawful conduct, is protected by the First Amendment. Compromise is a compelling United States foreign policy interest, which purportedly justifies the government's ability to override the U.S. Constitution's free speech clause. But Rubio cites no real foreign policy issues or evidence whatsoever, and it is critically important to note that the U.S. government is always constrained by the Constitution, regardless of what its officials might think. So in addition, van der Hout's firm, Khalil, is represented by Drattle and Lewis, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Creation Law Enforcement Accountability Responsibility Clear Project, New York University Immigrants' Rights Clinic, and the National New Jersey and New York arms of the ACLU. Molly Blinken, intern legal director at the NYCLU, said that Rubio's memo underscores that the government has ripped Mahmoud Khalil from his home and 9-month pregnant wife. I'm so sorry that happened to her. Dr. Noor Abdallah, solely because it disagrees with his speech. Controversial speech is not illegal, and political speech that criticizes the Israeli government or U.S. foreign policy is constitutionally protected. This is why we have to have the right to protest, the right to assemble. And look, I have my criticism of a lot of these protests, especially the hands-off protests. I get it. It's good to see people out there protesting. It's good to see people out there speaking out. But these are things that should really concern you. When you have, again, garbage and other material being thrown out from high buildings, and then, of course, you have a knock at the door from the political police, it makes the back of my hair stand up. Makes me afraid about what's coming around the corner. Tomorrow, 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 what lies tomorrow?